Michael Irons, Worlds Old and New, by Nathan Moore. Chapter 5 The Object of Giving. From under the broad brim of his black hat and shrouded in deepening twilight shadows, Michael Irons peered across the remote tavern table at the girl who sat there, shifting in her seat, disconcerted by the dark-clad man's oppressive gaze, yet she seemed resolved to remain. Her black hair was disheveled, her work-tanned face dirty from travel. Her wide gray eyes were sunken from exhaustion, red and dry from tears and staring with unblinking terror. Her brother, she had said, was possessed. But the manner she described was very strange. Strange enough for Irons to narrow his ice-blue eyes, confused. Because while he spoke French poorly, his understanding was unerring. For possession, why not seek a priest? Probed Irons, doing little to hide his distrust. Certainly a man of the cloth would have been simpler and safer to locate. The peasant shook her head as expected, but now also with a degree of exasperation, further illustrated by a frustrated furrowing of her brow. She did not believe he had heard her correctly, and his lack of faith in her story had begun to inspire genuine gall. This inclined Irons toward believing the girl, which interested him greatly. Not possessed, she insisted again. Changed. Replaced. His arm and leg were wrong. They looked like clay, or carved as if from wood or smooth stone. Her wide eyes stared at Irons again with stark conviction, a silent plea for him to understand, her resolve unmoved by his disbelief. I have heard some witch doctors in Africa who still practice dark rituals of animation, Irons suggested, his voice low. Perhaps someone in your village somehow. Again, the girl's head shook, cutting off his inquiry. He had been alone, and a cave-in had crushed him, she repeated for a moment with growing frustration. But here her shoulders slumped and what grit she had managed to gather dissipated. What returned was not my brother. It is a puppet jerking on strings. I could not bear to see him so perverted. She crossed herself at the recollection. It is not right, and I fled. This was 1 week and 3 days past. And I must assume you were not the only one to see your brother. The girl's eyes flitted for a moment, then nodded to his statement. The entire village was willing to accept it as a miracle, she muttered, her voice more defeated than ever. Then her eyes hardened once more. That was no miracle. Michael Irons lowered his own gaze, obscuring the pleading face with the broad, downturned brim of his hat, giving consideration. Despite the story's strangeness, the consistency and specificity intrigued Irons. He ruminated upon the possibilities. If the girl was insane, it would be the decent thing for him to see her safe home. Or, if she were bait, used to hook and draw victims to be robbed and murdered, then he would gladly spring her trap and rapidly rid the roads of such brigands. But if the story were true, and something supernatural was afoot, no matter the circumstance, each resolution was favorable, and thus it seemed to Irons he ought to accept the girl's proposal. Still, there were strange inferences mentioned, and Irons raised his ice-blue eyes to meet the girl's helpless gaze once more. Puppet. Irons focused on the word. Perverted and changed. You used these words firmly, and the first in particular implies a master. A fresh intensity in the cold man's eyes emerged. You seem familiar with the manner of this power, but only now that it has affected your brother do you seek aid. Now the girl's shoulders slumped further, and she grew small upon the rough stool, as if caught red-handed in petty larceny. There is, she finally spoke, her voice very small, an object. We call it the orb. It helps. Engrossed despite his skepticism, all other possibilities vanished from his mind, and Michael Irons believed this now to be the whole truth. He leaned forward, asking, What help? Any help, It does nothing else. Does it speak or ask? Does it require an exchange? No. You present a problem, and it fixes it. And then your brother's body was presented. Tears reappeared in the girl's eyes, and her small gloved hands clutched at her worn and muddy peasant dress. That is not my brother, she whispered. That voice speaks not of mere conviction, but firm certainty, Irons noticed, his tone direct. After a pause, and with the troubled solemnity of a virgin bride about to undress, the girl withdrew the glove of her left hand, still hiding the appendage from the room with the wide sleeve of her right arm so only Irons could see. Upon the hand, the two outmost fingers down to the knuckles appeared as if master-crafted, lightly textured wood. In color and form they matched the hand with uncanny precision, but the two smooth, doll-like texture and integrated fingernails laid bare their unnatural origins. Both fingers could be moved about as natural as her own flesh. I lost them during a harvest before my memory. When it was found some weeks ago, the orb gave me these. But you sought no one then. She bit her lower lip and shook her head, ashamed. They possess no sensation themselves, these fingers. They are always cold against me. The elders said many times I would grow to appreciate, but as much as I try, as much as they have helped me at work, these dead fingers are how I know. I know my brother is dead. The girl did not appear at the appointed time for them to depart before dawn the next morning. There was no evidence of when she left or under what conditions. Discreet questions were met with shrugs and blank stares. His countenance grew dour as Irons began his journey towards the girl's town, mindfully disallowing himself the hope of encountering her on the road. If the usual, less scrupulous sources did not provide answers, namely of the girl being kidnapped or murdered, then it was almost certain the trouble from home had followed her. Thus, home was where he would find her, in one condition or another. Irons managed the journey in 8 days. As expected, he did not come across the girl or her body, and no travelers he met had seen a person matching her description. This disquieted Irons, and further solidified his belief in the missing girl's story. The village in question Irons found to be a typical small farming community. A few stone and wattle houses nested in a valley near a creek, with a forest just beyond. A few fields had been sown on the side of the village opposite the forest, while ample sties ensured the little hamlet held more pigs than residents. Irons approached, unconcerned and unhurried, his eyes roving about, taking in the low hills, the thick and gnarled woods, the modest farm itself, paying subtle but particular attention to the mud, seeking potential signs of a struggle or anything untoward. There was no traditional evidence, but Irons could discern several strange stretches which marked recent activity. Most notably, the tracks were thorough enough that it seemed the entire minute community had been walking about with no clear aim. Had this effort been to block out tracks, the array of footprints would almost certainly have been more focused and concentrated. But this overabundance of indirect foot traffic covered almost every inch of the hamlet's muddy roads and seemed to serve no purpose other than to... Irons noticed and almost paused mid-step, calm but taken aback. The obfuscation attempt had not been to cover a struggle. Rather, it seemed a stretch of the muddy road had been rendered so perfect that it became altogether uncanny. This jarring and disturbing perfection was what had been purposefully trodden upon and muddled. With a mindful effort, Irons ceased to stare and continued onwards. An older man approached to greet Irons as he drew near. This individual, easily assumed to be the village elder, was a shorter man possessed of little hair on top of his head and an overabundance cascading from his chin. His body was stocky and stooped from a lifetime of honest work. but he certainly appeared healthy for his age. He currently bore a pleasant smile, which in itself was not odd, but it did seem to lack surprise. Irons assumed he was expected. "Good day, traveler," the elder greeted Irons, not bothering to hide his inspection of Irons' person, clearly trying to ascertain the purpose of a traveler in such a remote place. After all, who but someone on the run from the law would end up here? But it nevertheless seemed performative. "Good day, sir," Irons returned mildly with a respectful if perfunctory bow. In his experience, the best way to lie was to speak truth while merely omitting context or details. "I was enlisted to return a runaway home to here," he specified, "but she disappeared in the night 1 week hence. Perhaps she has returned of her own accord?" Now the old man's eyebrows furrowed somewhat, and he appeared more perplexed, though the smile remained. This confusion did seem genuine. "And you came here without this girl?" wondered the elder. An odd response. It almost seemed to Irons as if the old man were inconvenienced. Irons made a small gesture to his well-traveled garments, saying, "I am no stranger to the road. A few days spent to see a distraught runaway safely home is no burden." "A girl did run away," the elder acknowledged. "Mad she was." "Unfortunate," nodded Irons. Then, mindfully to not appear probing, added more gently, "She did seem out of sorts, the poor thing." The elder nodded in return, his eyes genuinely downturned, though when his shoulders sagged, it read to Irons like relief. "She has not returned here," said the elder. "If it was her who enlisted your aid, I must assume another equally mad notion took her during the night, forgetting all that you had discussed." "Unfortunate," Irons repeated, nodding as he openly scanned the village, noting the location of houses and the features of faces near enough to distinguish. Wonderful storyteller, even if mad. Spun tales of her brother being revived from certain death. Now his cold blue eyes turned towards the elder with arctic chill, intentionally fixating on the man indelicately, as if peering into his very soul. "As you say, she seemed quite mad." The elder did wilt somewhat under the directness of Irons' gaze, but he held fast and refused to cede ground. Eyes swiftly averted, the elder shrugged. The helpless action emerged stilted. "I must reiterate, she must have forgotten you and wandered away." "Pardon my insensitivity," uttered Irons, the edge in his eyes beginning to creep into his tone. "War has left my manners direct, callous, and blunt. But you sound entirely unconcerned with this girl's well-being." The elder squirmed. "Her condition made this end all but inevitable. Her mother will be distraught, of course, but if I seem callous, it is because, frankly, such person becomes a burden upon us all." The fact that this assertion struck Irons as honest incensed him, but he calmly placed that aside, using it to further rationalize the underhanded investigation already planned. The old man, despite his words fanning suspicion, let nothing tangible slip, and Irons concluded this was likely all the information a verbal exchange would gain. He withdrew his pressure and turned his gaze toward the late afternoon sun, mind on a less amicable survey after dark. "Unfortunate," Irons quietly remarked for the third time. "I will pray for her safety and watch for her on the return journey." Another small bow to the elder. "I apologize to have troubled you." "Do you need a place to stay for the night?" This kind inquiry was also not unusual. Lodging in a stable or storehouse could often be offered to unoffensive travelers. But Irons had spoken offensively, and something in the brittle, quick way the old man spoke struck Irons strange. It even smacked of a trap. So Irons accepted, confident he could overcome whatever this sleepy hamlet might array against him. He was proven correct. That night, 3 strapping but ineffective youths crept to where Irons stayed in the stable in an effort to bind him. Without proper context as to the precise conditions within this village, Irons made a quiet ambush of his own and merely knocked them out so he might begin his nighttime survey. A grip on his ankle, a hand. Irons all but leapt free from the hand of one of his assailants, pistol butt prepared to further bludgeon the lad. But the boy remained like a rag doll, quite unconscious. From his form, however, the left arm jittered and groped blindly about the stable's dirt and hay-strewn floor, wildly grasping as if trying to fulfill the last order it had been given. An arm replaced, part of his torso and back too, judging from the movement. This was the girl's brother, perhaps. The hair at least seemed similar. The hand and arm became less frantic and groped about in a measured, purposeful search. After a few moments, Irons prodded at the arm with his sword, which agitated the appendage back into angry flailing once more. But the rigid flesh approximation was strangely solid, almost akin to stone. Not wanting to chip his blade against the strange appendage, Irons sought to bludgeon, and now with relative ease cracked the living structure apart, ceasing his efforts before the shoulder, unwilling to gamble on the supposition that the boy was already dead and merely puppeted. One part unconscious while the other still moved seemed to indicate there was a distinction. The crushed pieces lay still while the shoulder continued to swivel about in silence. Now able to begin his search, Irons started with the most obvious location, the elder's cellar, and found immediate success. The orb, as the girl had named it, was the size of a fighting man's fist, resting on a linen-covered table that seemed reminiscent of an altar or shrine. The object itself emitted a dark purple-blue light which bathed the cellar about him in an ominous, otherworldly shimmer. It seemed to Irons that it would fit nicely in one's hand. This unbidden musing prompted a suspicious tilt of his head and a narrowing of his eyes. But for such a thought to surface so clearly, he could not help but interrogate his own mind. No! Again, Irons' mind seemed to move in a way too unnatural to go unnoticed. To preempt any other mental trickery, he withdrew a flintlock pistol and pointed it at the floating, slowly spinning object. "Please!" The voice of the village elder came from behind him, soft and quiet as usual, but now also strained with forlorn tension, desperate and well aware that, apart from words, he was powerless. "Please," the elder said again. "I know you are suspicious of us, but I swear to you the orb is a boon." Irons turned towards the elder while his pistol remained fixed on the dark object. "The girl showed me her fingers," Irons spoke quiet, his voice hard, "and I saw how her brother's arms sought me, clawing at me with a life all its own even as he lay unconscious. The girl was right, and you know this. Her brother is dead, and what propels him is an abominable approximation." The leather of his gloves creaked almost inaudibly as his grip on the weapon tightened, and his eyes narrowed while his already low tones gave into a threatening growl. "Pray, what came of the girl?" The elder did not meet Irons' eyes. He seemed not to be searching for a sympathetic rationale with which to beg, but instead for the words to correctly frame what had happened. Irons felt certain he would hear the words "unfortunate necessity," just as he had in war. Even as the other began to speak, a soft desire to believe the old man pushed into the mind of Irons, to trust the elder's wise words. These increasingly brazen efforts by the orb were becoming easy to push away, especially on matters of trust. Blind faith in any person had been killed from Irons long ago. "We wish to show her that the orb meant no harm," the elder was saying. "Its nature is to help." Before the elder could continue, Irons made a short, derisive scoff. "Have you never met a powerful person who simply wished to help?" Irons mocked softly, his features becoming humorless, as if he could not comprehend why anyone would believe such a thing. "Have you not met such a person certain they could help? so certain they will help regardless, whether or not their aid is wanted or even helpful at all. Have you seen an overzealous sawbones concept of help? A corrupt prison warden's concept of help? Tell me, if the girl would not believe the object and refused it, would it have decided she needed its help to understand? Should I assume the cure given her was akin to a horse cured of a broken leg? Or does her brain now have the texture and appearance of ivory? Iron's eyes grew vicious and his lip curled. Even if we set aside peaceable ends justifying murderous means, continued he, I must ask, have you never imagined what might happen if true, pure assistance were successful? What happens when a town regularly receives free food? People no longer bother to grow their own. They become reliant on the aid. And one day, you find they do not merely need the aid, but they presume it and become resentful of its absence. He gestured with his pistol toward the orb. How many problems did you first present the orb? And how many more do you present now? Not merely mortal wounds, but trivial things, I imagine. A cracked pot or broken chair, perhaps? Your lives are not better, merely easier. Iron spat upon the basement's wooden floor. Because you are willing to forget the price. The elder's eyes seemed confused at the final word. There is always a price, uttered Irons. Self-reliance is the manifestation of one's own soul, and you gave that to this thing in exchange for comfort. He exhaled a sharp sigh, and while his features seemed to soften, his eye remained as implacable as a glacier. Comfort is no sin, but I cannot accept an end as selfish as comfort justifying the oblivion of a young girl's life. Iron shook his head then, abruptly concluding that the orb's influence pushed him to wax verbose. But then, perhaps he pontificated for the purpose of avoiding violence, for there was little evil here. Regardless, Irons decided and steeled himself against further effort from the object. There is but one thing to do. And he fired a ball into the orb's tranquil surface. With a lackluster emission of dust and fragments, the purple lights vanished, and the object shattered, as if simple pottery.